I found out life was growing inside me while I was still awaiting my prison sentence. In the cell, the smell of bleach and rusted metal mixed with sorrow, and inside me, a tiny heart was beating. 9 months later, I gave birth to a son in a prison hospital. They gave me exactly 48 hours to hold him in my arms. Then they took him away, and the law said it was right. But my heart had never signed that law. It kept waiting. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Sarah Miller. I was 28 years old when I found out I was pregnant, and I was already in jail by then, waiting for my trial. Before all this, I had worked as a waitress at a roadside diner just outside El Paso, Texas. My life had been an endless loop of coffee pots, burnt toast, and late-night regulars who tipped in nickels. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Then everything changed. In a matter of weeks, my name became a number, my clothes became state-issued, and my future dissolved into a maze of locked doors and fluorescent lights. The day I found out, the air in the holding cell was thick with bleach and metal. It was one of those rooms that smelled like it had been scrubbed too hard for too many years, the scent never quite masking the deeper staleness beneath. I sat on the edge of the steel bench, my wrists red from the cuffs that had only just been removed, and stared at the cracks in the tile like they might spell out a way back to my old life. My stomach ached, not with pain but with something deeper, an unease that had been following me for weeks. I thought maybe it was the stress. I hadn't eaten right in days. My skin was pale and dry. My chest felt tight in the mornings. But there was something else, something unfamiliar blooming quietly inside me. I tried to ignore it because admitting it meant confronting a new kind of vulnerability. Then the guards came and called my name. I followed them to the infirmary without asking questions. In jail, you learn quickly that questions are luxury items. The nurse didn't smile. She didn't soften her voice or look me in the eyes. She did her job like she'd done it 1,000 times before, with gloves that snapped, a clipboard she didn't read aloud, and a tone that made everything feel clinical, distant, unimportant. I laid back on the paper-covered table and let her move cold instruments over my skin, draw my blood, take my pulse. I wanted to disappear into the ceiling tiles. I counted them while she worked. 23, each with a yellowed corner and a rust-stained frame. Then came the words, sharp and unceremonious. "You're pregnant." My body went cold. Everything inside me slowed, like the world had dropped into a thick liquid, and I was sinking. I stared at her lips, waiting for more, for some context, for a mistake. But she just turned, scribbled something, and left the room. No one asked if I wanted to keep it. No one asked if I was scared. No one even told me how far along I was. I was just a body with a result. When I returned to my cell, the fluorescent lights buzzed louder than before. I sat on my cot, hands resting on my lap, not sure where to place them. My cellmate didn't look at me. She was used to these silences, these private storms that passed through women's eyes every day. The mattress beneath me was too thin, the blanket scratchy against my arms, but none of it mattered. There was a heartbeat inside me now, a life that had no idea where it was growing. I tried to trace back the days, the weeks, to pinpoint the moment that child had taken root. I remembered a night, one night before the arrest, a moment of comfort wrapped in fear. I hadn't even thought it possible, not with the chaos that surrounded me. But life doesn't wait for permission. It just begins. In the darkness of that cell, with the walls closing in and the future pressed flat against the weight of charges I didn't fully understand, I placed my hand on my belly. I didn't feel anything yet, no movement, no flutter, but I imagined something forming, fingers, eyes, a spine. I imagined the shape of possibility in a place designed to crush it. The days that followed were filled with strange contradictions. I was both a suspect and a mother. I was accused of a crime I hadn't yet been sentenced for, and yet, inside me, innocence was growing, untainted, unaware, unburdened. It felt cruel and sacred at the same time. The guards didn't treat me any differently. I still stood for count. I still cleaned the same floors, ate the same bland food, wore the same gray uniform. But inside, something had shifted. I began to walk slower. I listened to my body. I ate what little I could stomach. I hoarded fruit from the meal trays and hid it in napkins to eat later when the nausea came. I stopped cursing under my breath. I whispered instead. Everything in me became softer, quieter, like I was protecting something fragile from the violence of routine. I started watching the other women more closely, wondering how many of them had gone through this, how many had given birth in shackles, had their babies taken from their arms before the scent of skin faded. I had heard whispers, stories passed in the laundry room and the chapel, babies born and gone within 48 hours, mothers left with stretch marks and silence. I tried not to let those stories dig into me, but they did. They burrowed deep, nesting beside the child I hadn't asked for, but already loved. There were nights I cried into my pillow, biting down on the corner to keep from making noise. The tears weren't only for myself, they were for what was coming, for the countdown I had already begun, because even in that first week I knew I wouldn't be allowed to keep him or her. I would be given hours, maybe days, before they took the child away. The law was clear. The system did not bend for motherhood. It did not make space for bond or biology. It followed paper and policy. Still, I dreamed. I dreamed of holding the baby against my chest, of whispering my name into a tiny ear, of kissing a forehead and memorizing the smell of new skin. I dreamed of humming lullabies I hadn't sung in years, of closing my eyes and pretending, just for a moment, that the walls around me weren't made of concrete and regret. I didn't know what would happen to me in court. I didn't know how long I would be locked away. But I knew that something inside me had already changed. I was no longer just Sarah Miller, waitress, inmate, case file. I was a mother now, even if the world didn't recognize it. Even if they took him from me, I would carry the memory of his heartbeat inside my own. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't entirely alone. The first trimester passed with a sense of unreality, as if my body had betrayed the setting I now inhabited. Jail was not a place where things began. It was a place of endings, of reckoning, of cold routines and stripped identities. And yet, something had begun inside me, quietly, stubbornly, impossibly. I woke each morning on a thin cot in a dim cell, my back aching, my stomach uneasy, my mind looping between fear and wonder. I wasn't supposed to feel this much. Not here, not now. At first, the other women didn't ask questions. There were rumors, always. Whispers floated through corridors and bounced off cinder block walls like ghosts. Someone had seen me vomiting in the infirmary. Someone else had noticed the way I sat curled, protective, one hand resting over my belly like a silent confession. But no one said anything directly. In a place where privacy was a rare commodity, pregnancy still carried a strange respect, perhaps because it reminded everyone that life continued, even in cages. I was assigned to a different unit halfway through the second month, placed in a quieter section where inmates with medical needs were sometimes kept. It wasn't mercy, it was protocol. Still, the cell was cleaner, the mattress was a shade thicker. The air didn't smell as strongly of bleach. I had a window now. It was small and narrow, frosted with grime, and barred in steel, but when the sun rose at the right angle, a sliver of gold would cut across the floor. I began to measure my days by that light. It became a silent ritual. Stand in the beam for a minute. Feel the warmth on my skin. Remember the world still turned. Time inside prison doesn't pass in weeks or months. It passes in counts, in meals, in lockdowns. And yet, my pregnancy gave me a new way to mark time, heartbeat by heartbeat. I learned to count the days by the changes in my body, the morning nausea, the slow thickening of my waist, the way my skin grew tighter across my belly. There were no ultrasounds unless deemed medically necessary, no comforting voice telling me how big the baby was, no family to call and share the news. But I listened to my body like it was telling me a secret. I learned to feel each movement as proof. I was not alone. There was a nurse named Carol who saw me every other week. She didn't smile often, but she was the only one who looked me in the eye when she took my vitals. She didn't say much, just numbers, weight, blood pressure, but her silence didn't carry judgment. That was a gift in a place where judgment was the currency of every interaction. She gave me prenatal vitamins, handed me pamphlets with missing pages, and once, just once, slipped me an extra granola bar without a word. I held on to that kindness like it was a thread tying me to the outside. In the 5th month, I began writing. I stole paper from the library cart and used a dull pencil I kept hidden in a crack behind the radiator. I didn't write letters. I had no one to send them to. I wrote for the child. Descriptions, stories, pieces of myself I didn't want to forget. I wrote about a tree from my childhood backyard, the way its branches curved like open arms. I wrote about my mother's hands, about cinnamon toast, about the sound of cicadas on hot summer nights. I wrote about love, even though I wasn't sure I had ever known it fully. I wrote because I wanted this baby to know something of the world beyond bars. Sleep became both refuge and enemy. I dreamed often. Some nights, I dreamed of giving birth in a clean white room, where someone placed a warm bundle in my arms and whispered, "He's yours." Other nights, I dreamed of alarms blaring, of doors slamming shut, of faceless men taking the baby away before I could even see his face. I woke up crying more than once, the sound of my own voice foreign in the silence. As my belly grew, so did the distance between me and the other inmates. Not all of them avoided me, but I felt the shift. Pregnancy set me apart in ways I hadn't expected. Some looked at me with pity, some with quiet disdain. One woman muttered once that bringing a child into this place was cruel. I didn't answer. How could I explain that I hadn't planned this, that love hadn't been part of the equation, that life, like fate, sometimes moved without permission? I learned to speak to the child in whispers. At night, when the cell block finally settled into a restless hush, I would lie on my side and press my hand to my belly, murmuring nonsense, songs, memories, half prayers. I didn't know if the baby could hear, but I needed to believe that something I said might stay with him, that one day, somewhere far from here, A phrase would echo in his mind like a shadow of something safe. In the 7th month, I was taken to a mandatory parenting class. It was held in a beige room with folding chairs and peeling posters of babies taped to the walls. A woman with tired eyes talked about diaper changes, feeding schedules, swaddling. Her voice was kind, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the plastic baby doll on the table. It looked so clean, so artificial, so breakable. When they handed it to me for practice, my hands shook. It didn't weigh anything, and that absence of weight terrified me more than anything else. The closer I came to the due date, the more I noticed time speeding up. The days lost their stretch. Everything became real, tangible. My steps grew slower, my body heavier, my breathing more labored. I began to walk with one hand resting on my lower back, the other cradling the roundness of my belly. The guards said nothing, but I caught their glances, some softer, some colder. I couldn't read them. The 8th month brought pain, not contractions, those would come later, but aches that lived in my spine, in my hips, in the arches of my feet. There were no warm baths here, no soft chairs, no arms to lean on. I learned to prop myself up against the wall at night, legs folded, hands clenched around my ribs. I stopped pretending to be strong. I simply endured. When the 9th month arrived, I began to count hours instead of days. Every twinge of discomfort made my breath hitch. Every movement felt like a signal. I packed and repacked the small bag they allowed me. A pair of socks, a folded towel, a plastic comb. It wasn't much, but it was all I had to carry with me into that next terrifying chapter. I didn't know how long I'd have with the baby once he was born. 48 hours, they had said. 2 days. I held on to that number like a promise and a curse. I wasn't ready, but I had been waiting forever. And in the quiet of those last nights, when everything inside me ached and trembled, I whispered again into the dark, not to ask for time, but to promise something, that even if I only held him for a moment, it would be enough to love him forever. The pain started before the sun had risen. A low ache wrapped deep in my spine, pulsing in waves I couldn't yet name. For a while, I tried to ignore it, curling my body tighter under the thin blanket, telling myself it was just another restless night on a concrete slab pretending to be a bed. But my body knew better. Something ancient had awakened, something primal and irreversible, something that didn't care about where I was or what I had done. It simply moved forward, steady and inevitable, like a river breaking through a dam. By the time the lights in the cell block flickered on, the ache had sharpened into real contractions. I breathed through them quietly, biting the inside of my cheek, unwilling to call out too soon. There's a certain pride you build in confinement, an instinct to downplay pain, to stay invisible, to not ask for help unless you're drowning. But when the first real wave came, gripping my insides like a vice, I pressed the emergency button on the wall with trembling fingers. A guard arrived, annoyed, disinterested. I told her it had started. She stared for a second longer than necessary, then radioed for transport. Everything after that moved both too fast and too slow. I was escorted down hallways I had never seen before, through locked doors that opened with a mechanical click, into a corridor with white tiles and rubber wheels squeaking on polished floors. The infirmary was not built for warmth. It smelled of antiseptic and rust, the air so sterile it made my skin itch. They made me change into a gown. It was stiff and starched, the color of an old bruise. I lay on a gurney while a nurse checked my dilation with latex-covered fingers and an unreadable face. She didn't speak much, only charted numbers on a clipboard and nodded to someone behind me. Another contraction came, stronger, and I gasped. No one held my hand. No one said it would be okay. There were no familiar voices, no soothing words, just fluorescent lights buzzing above and machines humming beside me. Eventually, I was wheeled into a small delivery room. It looked like a forgotten corner of a hospital, the equipment outdated, the walls scuffed and gray. A single window sat too high to see out of. I stared at the ceiling, counting stains on the tiles, trying to separate myself from the pain growing inside me. Each contraction was a reminder that this was real, that the child I had carried alone, in silence, in steel and stone, was now ready to arrive in a world that had already decided not to welcome him. They shackled my right ankle to the bed. Standard procedure, they said. Even in labor, I was an inmate first. The metal cuff dug into my skin, cold and unforgiving. I tried not to think about it, but every time I moved, it reminded me. I was giving birth not as a mother, but as a number, as a risk to be managed, as a liability. The pain intensified. My body folded into itself, wave after wave, my breath ragged, my grip crushing the edge of the mattress. I screamed, not for help, but because the body does what it must when torn open by life. There were people in the room, faceless under masks, moving with clinical precision. I heard murmurs, beeping, the rustle of gloves, the clatter of instruments being prepared. But I felt alone, more alone than I had ever felt in my life. When it came time to push, the nurse gave the command like a coach on the sidelines, sharp, impersonal, efficient. I obeyed. I pushed through pain that felt like fire, through the weight of fear, through the crushing knowledge that as soon as he arrived, he would be taken. I pushed with my entire being, every cell, every memory, every dream. I pushed not just to give him life, but to remind myself that I had created something pure in a place built for punishment. And then he came. The room filled with the sound of his cry, high, thin, fierce. It cut through the sterility like sunlight through dust. They placed him on my chest for only a moment, just long enough for me to see him, to feel the warmth of his skin, to trace the outline of his face with my fingertips. He was tiny, red-faced, perfect. His fingers curled instinctively, and I bent to kiss his forehead, breathing him in like oxygen I had been deprived of for 9 long months. Time froze. That single minute stretched wide and endless, holding everything I had ever needed. The pain receded. The fear vanished. For that instant, I was not an inmate. I was not a mistake. I was simply a mother holding her son. Then they took him. The nurse reached down and lifted him from my chest. I felt the separation like a tearing. I wanted to scream, to grab him back, to fight every rule in that damn place. But I didn't move. The chain on my ankle reminded me of my place. I watched them clean him, wrap him, weigh him, write things down on a clipboard. I memorized every detail, the shape of his mouth, the curve of his nose, the way his eyes fluttered shut again. I tried to etch his face into my mind, to burn it into a part of me that prison couldn't reach. They placed him in a plastic hospital bassinet, transparent and distant. I reached for him with my eyes, because it was all I had left. My arms ached from the emptiness. My body, still bleeding, still torn, felt like a ghost shell of what had just been whole. The doctors left. The nurses, too. The room grew quiet. A guard came and stood by the door. I turned my head and stared at the wall, unable to cry, unable to sleep. My body pulsed with aftershocks, but I didn't care. My heart was no longer inside me. It was in that bassinet, inches away and out of reach. I didn't ask where he would go. I already knew. Somewhere else, with someone else, to a foster placement or a relative, if any were willing. I had filled out forms, checked boxes, signed my name in ink that meant nothing to me. They told me I would have 48 hours. That was the law. After that, the state would make decisions, not me. That night, they wheeled me back to recovery. The bassinet came too. He slept beside me, quiet and swaddled, while I lay awake, counting each breath he took. I didn't sleep. I watched him. I whispered his name into the dark, over and over, like a prayer no one else could hear. His name was Elijah, and he was mine, even if the world refused to let him stay. They told me I had 48 hours, not with a smile, not with kindness, just a flat administrative statement delivered by a nurse whose shoes squeaked on the linoleum and whose voice had long since forgotten how to be gentle. 48 hours, like it was a courtesy, a number, a policy, not the entirety of my motherhood measured out in hours and minutes and seconds. I didn't waste time asking for more. I knew there was no petition, no plea, no look I could give that would alter the shape of what had already been decided. The clock started ticking the moment they wheeled me into the recovery room, still bleeding, barely stitched, my body hollowed and humming with pain. But none of it mattered, because beside me, in a plastic hospital bassinet on wheels, lay a miracle wrapped in a thin blue blanket. His chest rose and fell like a whisper, soft and slow, and I couldn't stop watching him. I named him Elijah. I said it aloud the first time when the nurse asked for a name for the birth certificate. I said it again when I leaned over his crib and whispered it into the tiny shell of his ear. Elijah. It sounded like light, like water, like something that could keep growing even when nothing else could. I whispered it until it felt real, until it belonged to both of us. I was allowed to hold him, feed him, bathe him. They gave me a plastic bottle with pre-mixed formula and a small cloth for burping. The first time I fed him, my hands shook so badly I had to brace the bottle with both palms. His mouth found the nipple instinctively, and he drank with the soft focus of a newborn who knew only hunger and warmth. I watched his eyelashes flutter. I counted the wrinkles in his knuckles. I memorized his breathing like a lullaby. The room was dim, and the walls were painted in a shade of beige that pretended to be calming. It wasn't. It was hollow, sterile, meant to neutralize emotion, not contain it. I sat in a chair by the window, clutching Elijah to my chest, the light from the blinds striping his face like prison bars. I thought about the irony of it, how I was cradling freedom in a place designed for punishment. The nurses came in and out. Some avoided my gaze. Others lingered for a moment too long, as if they wanted to say something but couldn't. One brought me an extra pillow. Another left a warm washcloth without a word. Small kindnesses that pierced deeper than cruelty ever could. I was a mother, but only temporarily. They knew it. I knew it. He didn't. I slept in short bursts, afraid to close my eyes for too long. What if he cried and I missed it? What if someone came while I slept and rolled his bassinet out the door? I needed every minute. I wanted to bottle time, to pin it down and slow it. But it was slippery. It moved whether I begged it to or not. On the second morning, he cried for the first time in a way that shook the air. Not a newborn wail, but something deeper, sharper, like he sensed something was about to change. I picked him up, pressed him to my chest, and rocked him slowly, murmuring nonsense words, old lullabies, the sound of his name, Elijah, Elijah, Elijah. The nurse entered with a clipboard. Her face was unreadable. She told me the social worker would arrive in the afternoon, that I should begin to prepare. The word prepare landed like a stone. How does one prepare to be erased? I bathed him slowly in a plastic tub, using the hospital-issued baby soap that smelled like powder and something synthetic. I dried him with a towel that was too rough for skin so new. I dressed him in the softest onesie I had, plain white with tiny buttons I struggled to fasten with shaking fingers. I brushed his hair, just a trace of it, with my fingertips, over and over, like the motion could stay with him longer than my arms could. Then I wrote him a letter. I used a pen from the nurse's station and a sheet of paper from the back of my chart. I wrote in block letters, neat and slow, because I didn't know when or if he would read it. I told him I loved him, that I never wanted to let him go, that he came into this world inside the darkest place and became the only light I could see. I didn't explain the circumstances. I didn't talk about mistakes or time or prison. I just told him he was wanted, that he was real, that I was his mother, no matter where he went. When the social worker came, she wore a cardigan and a necklace with a small silver bird. She smiled gently, the kind of smile reserved for breakable things. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't, because she was carrying out the sentence that had been passed long before she arrived. She asked if I wanted a few more minutes. I nodded. I sat back in the chair. I held him one last time. I placed his ear against my heart and told him that's where he could always find me. I kissed the crown of his head, his eyelids, his tiny fists. I told him he was brave. I told him to sleep when he was tired, to laugh when he could, to forgive me someday if he ever needed to. Then I handed him over. I didn't watch them leave. I couldn't. The door clicked shut like the closing of a cell, and I felt the silence echo in my chest. I sat still, my arms empty, my gown wrinkled, my body still sore from birth. The nurses cleared the room quietly. The bassinet was gone, the bottles, the blanket, the sound of breathing that wasn't mine. I looked at the clock on the wall, 47 hours and 53 minutes. That was all. But he had been mine, and I had been his, and that, I told myself, would have to be enough. The days after they took Elijah blurred into one long stretch of aching silence. My body, still heavy from labor, walked the halls like a ghost. The pain in my abdomen lingered, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness in my arms. I returned to my old cell, back to the same bunk, the same walls, the same routine. But everything had shifted. I was no longer just an inmate. I was a mother without a child, and the absence of him sat in my chest like a stone I could not swallow. They gave me a few photographs, 3 to be exact. One from the day of his birth, his eyes closed, mouth open in a cry, swaddled in that thin blue blanket. Another of him at 6 months, seated awkwardly in a baby chair with a toy giraffe leaning beside him. And the third, around his first birthday, standing with help, gripping a piece of furniture, looking off camera with wide, curious eyes. I stared at those photos until the edges frayed. I folded them neatly into the pages of a book I checked out from the prison library, and I carried that book everywhere with me like scripture. The letters I wrote never reached him. They weren't allowed. I still wrote them anyway. hundreds maybe, on lined paper with a dull pencil or a pen I borrowed from the commissary. I addressed them to Elijah Miller, and I dated each one in the top right corner like a diary entry. I wrote about everything: the weather, my thoughts, my dreams. I told him about the books I read, the birds I saw through the narrow window, the food I avoided in the cafeteria. I told him I loved him, over and over, always that: I love you, I love you, I love you. I imagined him growing. First teeth, first steps, first words. I pictured him holding hands with a foster parent on his way to school, his tiny fingers wrapped around someone else's. That thought broke me more than anything. The idea of him reaching for comfort and finding it in someone else's arms. But I also hoped, fiercely, that those arms were kind, that whoever held him when he cried whispered softly, that someone tucked him in at night and left a light on near the door, that someone told him he mattered, even if they never told him why. I watched the seasons change through the strip of sky visible from the yard. Winter brought a pale, biting wind. Spring turned the concrete edges green with moss. Summer made the bricks sweat. Autumn dusted the corners with brittle leaves. Time passed not in milestones, but in shifts of light, changes in shadow. My body healed. My sentence continued, and every cell in me still reached for him. Once a year, I was allowed to request a status report. It was clinical, impersonal, a one-page document with words like stable placement, developing normally, and no issues reported. They never included a photograph. They never told me who he lived with, or what he liked to eat, or what made him laugh. I learned to read between the lines, to look for signs in the blank spaces. No news, I told myself, meant he was safe. Some women in prison became mothers after their release. They left and returned to their children, rebuilt the bridges they could, burned the ones they couldn't. I envied them, not their freedom, though I longed for that too, but their continuity, their right to be remembered. I didn't know if Elijah even knew my name. I didn't know if anyone told him he had come from someone, from me. There were nights when the weight of that uncertainty kept me from sleep. I would lie on the top bunk and stare at the ceiling, the old rust stains resembling constellations. I named them after moments I could remember. His first cry, the heat of his body against mine, the exact shape of his ears. Small details. That's all I had, and I held on to them with a desperation that bordered on madness. In group therapy sessions, I never spoke. I listened. I watched the women beside me unravel and mend their grief in public, weaving stories of lost custody and fractured families. I wasn't ready to say it aloud, to give it shape in front of strangers. My grief was private. It was holy. It lived inside me like a second heartbeat. Years passed. My hair grew longer, then grayer. My hands grew rough from kitchen duty. My name was eventually moved to a new block, with quieter inmates and fewer fights. I began mentoring younger women, helping them navigate their own losses. Some of them called me Mama out of habit. It startled me every time. I answered to it, even though it hurt. The thought that he might forget me was unbearable, so I made promises to myself. When I was released, I would find him. I would stand at a distance, if that's all I could do. I would watch him from across the street, from behind a tree in a park, from a seat in the back row of a school auditorium. I didn't need him to know me. I just needed to see that he had become someone in the world, that he had become more than a file. Once, in my 11th year, I dreamed of him as a teenager. He was sitting on a porch step, tying a shoelace. He looked like me, but he had his father's eyes. In the dream, he turned to me and said, "I know you." I woke up with tears soaked into my pillow, my fists clenched around the edge of the mattress like I had been holding him again. And then one day, out of nowhere, a guard approached with a sealed envelope. My name was written in a careful, unfamiliar hand. My stomach twisted as I opened it. Inside was a letter, short, formal. It was from his guardian. Elijah had asked about his birth mother. He had been told the truth. He wanted to know more. My knees buckled beneath me. I sat on the floor and read it again and again. My hands trembled so hard I could barely keep hold of the paper. He knew I existed. He had spoken my name. That night, I wrote him the longest letter of my life, pages and pages of everything I had never been allowed to say. I told him who I was, who I had been, who I tried to become. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't ask for anything. I only gave him the truth because that's all I had left. The years had taken so much from me, but they hadn't taken everything. They hadn't taken my love, and they hadn't taken the hope that someday, somehow, he would love me back. The morning I was released, the sky was gray and flat like wet stone. I remember how it looked because I had imagined it differently so many times. Blue and golden, open and warm. But it was just gray, the kind of gray that wraps around your bones and doesn't let go. I stood at the edge of the prison gates with a small plastic bag in my hand. Inside were my belongings, a worn paperback, 2 letters I had kept folded inside a sock, a government-issued ID with a photo I barely recognized, and a laminated packet with instructions on where to report for parole. I didn't step forward right away. I just stood there, looking out at the stretch of road and trees beyond the fence, wondering if I was still the same person who had entered so many years before. The guards behind me didn't say anything. They had done this 100 times. For them, it was just another shift, another woman walking out into a world she no longer belonged to. But for me, it was the beginning of something I didn't yet have words for. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache. My knees felt unsteady. My shoulders carried years of tension like a weighted vest. I took one step forward, then another. Each movement was slow, deliberate, not because I was afraid of the world outside, but because I was afraid of what I might not find in it. They had told me months before that I was eligible for early release. I had served my time. I had completed the programs. I had kept my head down, followed rules, swallowed my grief without making noise, and now the gate had opened. But the only thing I could think about was Elijah. He was 17 now. Somewhere out there, maybe not far, was a young man with my eyes and someone else's name. I didn't know what he looked like anymore. I didn't know what kind of music he listened to, whether he liked sports or books, whether he hated the cold or loved the snow. I didn't know who had raised him or how often he had thought of me. I only knew that he existed, and that knowing kept me alive. My parole officer's office was in a converted strip mall next to a nail salon and a payday loan shop. I sat in the lobby for 20 minutes before anyone called my name. They handed me a stack of forms, a bus voucher, and a pamphlet about transitional housing. I answered questions like a machine, nodding when expected, signing where told. But all I could think of was the letter I had written to Elijah a year ago, the one that had been delivered, the one I still hadn't heard back from. The shelter they sent me to had a twin bed with a frame that creaked and a communal bathroom with chipped tiles. I kept my few things in a plastic drawer under the bed and folded my clothes with the same precision I had learned in prison. I got a job at a bakery around the corner. Early mornings, long hours, the smell of yeast and flour following me home like a second skin. I didn't mind. It kept my hands busy while my heart waited. Every evening, after work, I walked 2 blocks to the public library. I applied for a card, registered for an email address, and used the computer for exactly 1 hour. I searched for his name. I checked school rosters, sports teams, yearbooks, honor roll announcements. I typed Elijah Miller into every database I could find, even though I knew his name had likely been changed. Some days I cried in the restroom stall between baking shifts. Other days I didn't feel anything at all. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I received a letter. It was thin and plain, postmarked from a town I recognized only vaguely from my prison paperwork. The handwriting was unfamiliar, careful, unsure. I sat down on the edge of my bed and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were just a few sentences, short, measured, but the last line burned into me like sunlight through stained glass. If you'd like to meet, I'd like that too. I read it 5 times before I could breathe. The next few days moved like syrup. I wrote back immediately, folding the page with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. I told him I would come whenever he was ready. I gave the shelter's mailing address. I didn't ask questions. I didn't make demands. I simply opened a door and waited. Weeks passed. Then one morning, another letter came. This time, it included a time, a date, and a place. A small diner off a rural highway, 2 towns over. He had chosen a neutral space. I understood that. I memorized the address and held it like a fragile object, afraid the ink would fade if I stared too long. I borrowed a blouse from one of the other women at the shelter. I scrubbed my shoes. I braided my hair the way I used to when I was young, though my hands felt strange, unfamiliar with softness. The bus ride was quiet, the countryside moving past the window in shades of green and gold. I stared at my reflection in the glass and tried to find the parts of me that were still his. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived. A waitress handed me a menu and poured coffee I didn't drink. I sat in a corner booth, my back to the window, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my heart stuttered. And then he walked in. I knew him instantly. Tall, slender, with shoulders slightly hunched like he hadn't grown into them yet. His hair was dark and a little too long. His eyes swept the room cautiously, then landed on me. He hesitated. Then he took a step, another, until he stood at the edge of the booth, saying nothing. I nodded, barely able to speak. He slid into the seat across from me, his hands fidgeting with the napkin dispenser. For a moment, we just sat in silence, 2 strangers held together by blood and absence. Then he looked at me, not through me, not past me, but at me, and I saw it. Recognition, not of memory, but of something deeper, a knowing. "I'm Sarah," I said. "I know," he replied, and that was all. It was enough. Hope had carried me through the darkest years of my life. Now it sat in front of me, in flesh and breath, in eyes that had survived their own storms. I didn't reach for him. I didn't rush. I simply sat still, letting the moment wrap around us like a warm, invisible thread. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this. The door was open, and we were both standing on the threshold.